Hello, everyone. I'm Sahana on behalf of Socion and Societal Platform teams. Thank you very much for joining us this morning or evening, depending on where you're from. The anthropologist Ruth Benedict proposed culture as a factor in human performance. Quoting from her work, Patterns of Culture, published in 1934, start quote, "No individual can arrive even at the threshold of her potentialities without a culture in which she participates. Conversely, no civilization has in it any element which in the last analysis is not the contribution of an individual," end quote. This dichotomy between the individual and the collective or a collaborative is a conversation that comes up again and again and that many of us have been party to. We hear the importance of collaborating from various sources. What does it take? Is collaboration same as partnerships? What are the tools? What are the incentives? What do we do individually? Then when do we come and collectively, work together? Who will fund it? What are the tools? What's the role of technology? Through this series that we're calling Winning Together, a collaboration of Socion and Societal Platform, our endeavor is to attend to several of these questions. We will share our learnings, our curation, engage with you, bring in practitioners, and over the course of 4 such sessions from now to March 2021, we will kind of illustrate how we could work together across the ecosystem to amplify collective societal impact. So once again, welcome to the session. And thanks to all of you for filling out the poll in the registration form and sharing your questions. That has helped us inform today's session and the sessions to come and the content in it. Sanjay, if you could move to the next slide, please. So before I introduce the speakers that are there in this slide, just some basic housekeeping. We're using the meeting feature of Zoom rather than the webinar feature, rather intentionally, to encourage and to allow for better engagement with you, our audience. We request you to go on mute when the speakers are presenting, but during the Q&A, for which we have 2 such slots, we request you to unmute and voice your questions and also show us your face. Don't worry, I say this all the time, don't worry about background noises of your kids, either old or young, pets or teachers shouting through your online classes or sounds from your kitchen. They all represent what 2020 has been for all of us. Coming to today's session, there are 3 speakers today who are joining us. Anand Arkalgud, who's the co-founder of Socion, an advisory firm that focuses exclusively on enabling impact initiatives at scale. Sanjay Purohit, Chief Curator of Societal Platforms and Initiative of Extra Foundation. And we're joined by Mala Subramaniam, CEO of Arghyam, whose mission is to strengthen the ability of ecosystems to enable water security for 100 million people by 2023. The agenda, which is on the next slide, is over the course of 90 minutes, the session will be divided into 3 parts, where each speaker will present, and then we have a poll in between, and then 2 interactive sessions that are baked in. So on that note, over to you, Sanjay, to kickstart the session.
Thank you, Sahana, and hello and welcome to all on this call. Lots of friends, lots of familiar faces, so it's always good to be amongst friends and family. I hope all of you are taking care and staying safe in these surreal times that we are working through. My objective today is to share with you a broader background from a societal platform and societal thinking perspective, and then hand over to Anand to essentially anchor the core of the session. And of course, then we will listen to Mala, who would bring in the on-the-ground experience of applying some of this thinking in the water sector, in the work that Arghyam is driving in India. And so it's with that objective that I will take a few minutes and sort of societal platform thinking is an idea which is multidimensional. Some of you on the call are familiar with it, but many may not be. So I am going to start from a little bit of a backdrop, and those of you who are familiar, please be patient through a few minutes and reflect upon some of the things we have discussed in the past. Summarily, as we are working through the large-scale development problems, we realize that the problems of education, healthcare, urbanization, livelihoods, justice, financial inclusion, and I could keep on going across all the SDGs. These are essentially wicked problems, and wicked problems essentially are characterized by three important dimensions. One is that they are large. In the end, today we are talking, at least before COVID, we were talking of about 3.4 billion people who were at or below the $5.5 a day line. And as we understand, in the last 9 to 10 months, this number has shot up further by about 400 to 440 million, given how COVID has impacted the world. So we're really dealing with large problems, not only at a global scale, but even at a country scale. We are dealing with problems which are dynamic, which means that they move with time. They are not that they are static problems to be covered. Sometimes the problems are such, Anand and I speak about this a lot, saying these are problems that have the potential to grow faster than their solutions. And hence, we cannot deal with exponential problems with linear solutions. And they are complex. Many of you are deep practitioners of systems change. So I'm sure that you would appreciate the fact that the key dimension of complex problems is their unpredictability. And that is what we're dealing with. And so we're dealing with large, dynamic, and complex problems. And over the last few years, we've been trying to understand, are there alternative ways to deal with large, dynamic, and complex problems? Large, dynamic, complex problems are not new. They've been around for decades. It is not that anyone is attempting to solve them or address them for the first time. It is just that we are making an attempt at applying some of the learnings with such large problems in the work that various teams have been doing to see if there is one more alternative, one more attempt at solving large, dynamic, and complex problems. Of course, I love this topic of the distinction between complex and complicated. The simplest example is making a rocket is complicated, but raising a child is complex. And so we are dealing with problems which have their own characteristic in terms of being unpredictable. There's a very nice quote from Aristotle. It says, in the case of all things which have several parts and in which the totality is not, as it were, a mere heap, but the whole is something besides the parts. And that is what we are dealing with, a whole that is something besides the parts. So trying to solve it in parts does not solve the whole. And so it's an endeavor at solving complex problems in healthcare, complex problems in water scarcity, climate change, public education, financial inclusion, and so on and so forth. Each of them possess this characteristic where government, civil society, and private sector have an active role to play and come together to try and deal with some of these challenges ahead of us. This led us down the path of trying to understand what do we build on, and obviously, like they say, that you can look very far by standing on the shoulders of giants. So design thinking was one attempt at solving specific problems, though the idea was conceived in 1935, formalized in 2004. It has proven itself as a good mechanism of solving specific problems. And then, of course, we stood on the shoulders of systems thinking, which was conceived in 1956, but formalized in 1991, focused on how to solve in complex systems. And we said, let's build beyond our experiences, with our experiences thinking, to saying what we call as societal thinking, which was conceived in 2004, but formalized as a structured discipline in 2016, with the question saying, how do you solve together at scale? So it is not so to say, a lateral construct. It's a progressively cumulative construct, solving specific problems, solving problems in a complex system, and solving it together at scale. And that is what we are attempting to bring into these conversations. 2004, Rohini Nilekani, who is the founder of, co-founder of Eight Step Foundation, had started her work at Pratham Books with the vision of putting a book in every child's hand. And one thing led to the other. And then over the years, multiple experiences led us to this idea of societal thinking in 2016. Let me give you a quick view into it. The central idea is, how do we orchestrate key societal actors and enable them to solve our problems together at scale? Two keywords, orchestrate and enable. And of the many dimensions of this thinking, today Anand, Mala, and I will touch upon one dimension, which is around how do you build a solid enabling infrastructure to orchestrate and enable a sector to solve a problem at scale. And that's the core idea. And we said, if you have to explain this core idea, where can we draw some inspiration from? And who is the master of large, complex, and dynamic systems but nature? So we went back to Mother Nature and we said, hey, do you have something that could help us? Explain what we are trying to think through. And so we studied a lot of forms of biological evolution. One of the evolution forms that we studied was the Cambrian radiation. About 541 million years ago, all of a sudden, in a short span of 10 million years in biological evolution, 10 million years is a very small period of time, almost all the major animal phyla appeared and diversification accelerated. And it was like an explosion. And we said, is there something that we can learn from this phenomenon and apply it to the development sector? How do you establish a new ecosystem nurturing life as we see today? This is what happened in that period. So we studied this quite a lot. And of course, it's a fairly well-researched and studied area. And we realized there are three important facets of this. And these three things hold a very important lesson for us. Firstly, in this period, atmosphere, which was very difficult before this period, became conducive. And so we said the framework that we create for driving large-scale change should focus on making atmosphere conducive for scale, harmonizing the actions of civil society actors, NGOs, philanthropy, funders, government, and the private sector. What does it take to make an environment where these three types of actors can actually work in a harmonized fashion? So that has to be a part of this thinking. Second was, in the Cambrian period, habitats which were very uniform before that. Remember, Earth was a lot of water for a long period of time. It became very diverse. So we said we must embrace diversity and create a mechanism by which we can embrace very, very diverse contextual innovations. So that became the second pillar of societal platform thinking. And the third thing was that in the Cambrian period, oxygen, which was scarce, became abundant, giving rise to a very rapid growth in aerobic organisms. And so we said in the development sector, what is scarce? What is scarce and yet pivotal? Anand uses some pivotal scarce resources, things around which a lot of change can be pivoted. How do you make pivotal scarce resources abundant? And so these three became the cornerstones of societal platform thinking, saying, if you take a sector like water or education or livelihoods or healthcare or financial inclusion, what are the scarce resources? How do we make them abundant? How do you ensure that you create an environment for diversity in innovation and not standardization of solutions and not distribution of ready-made, ready-to-use, proven answers, but allow the agency of the actors in the ecosystem to solve problems? And how do you make the environment conducive for a joint action by civil society, government, and the private sector? Because these problems are so large, nobody can solve them alone. This led us to create this societal platform model, which has three elements. Impact amplification networks. How do you use network effects of people coming together? Innovation co-creation environments in which diverse actors with their local knowledge, their contextual knowledge, their hyper-local understanding can actually design things that work in that context, in that society, in that socioeconomic environment with the level of infrastructure available in that area, and is powered by an enabling infrastructure that allows you to conserve energy, conserve capacity, and make that scarce resources abundant. So that is how we landed up. And today's discussion is focused on the bottommost layer, which is how do you create a shared enabling infrastructure and use it for coming together and bringing together and binding an ecosystem together to win at scale. Multiple platforms are currently in motion. For example, ECHO works in healthcare, Diksha works with teachers and education in India, Reap Benefit works with civic action, eGov works in urban transformation. Arghyam is the case that we are highlighting today, which works on water security. Shiksha Lokam works in school leadership. We could keep going. It's a long list, but these are just some of the examples. And of course, we can reference them offline, where this thinking is being applied so that we can solve large, dynamic, complex problems at scale. The objective here is to achieve exponential scale. Exponential is an important word. Radical inclusion, rather than just sort of say touching the subject of diversity inclusion, and embracing a diversity of solutions. So this is the fundamental construct that we are all working with. Over time, a platform ecosystem is emerging where multiple different topics or multiple different sectors are slowly embracing this platform thinking, whether it's lifelong learning or financial inclusion or preventive healthcare, habitats or emerging livelihood, but also specifically true to many of the experiences that we have in India is a second layer of context-aware platforms like identity, payments, registries, trust infrastructure, which are more fundamental to a nation's development, are getting built out, sitting on top of context-independent platforms like mobile cloud, internet, GPS, etc. So this is sort of creating an ecosystem of platforms. So a platform is an ecosystem of actors. What we are seeing slowly emerging out is an ecosystem of platforms itself in India, as well as we are now seeing it emerge out in parts of Africa. And there are very early seeds in Latin American countries that we are starting to see this construct of ecosystems of platforms coming together. So the summary that I wanted to share with you was in this context of how do you put platform thinking in the service of society, because all of us use platform thinking in our regular commercial context, whether you are using an Uber or using an Amazon, but those are for different reasons. Whereas if we design it for a larger good to the people who are underserved or not served, the 3.4+ billion people who are not gaining the advantages of platform, how do you do that is the endeavor that we are on. And today's session is focused on, like I was saying, the layer that you would see at the bottom of this chart, which is assets, knowledge, processes, different kinds of connections, data. How do you make that reusable, interoperable infrastructure so that we can all come together and win this war against wicked problems? So that is the, so to say, backdrop in the generic. And of course, now the fun is all in the specifics. And so I would invite Anand to take us down the specifics, before which Sahana is going to conduct a poll. And after that, we would listen to Anand share with us some very exciting stuff that he has been working on. Okay, here's the poll.
So there are 3 questions. If you could share your responses, please. We'll give it another 30 seconds and we'll get 10 more people to go. Okay. 10 more seconds. Okay, so we'll end the poll unless there are like 10 people who are yet to. Right. Okay. Let's see what you all are saying. Ending and sharing the results now. Anand, do you want to take it from here? It's a good segue.
Yes, absolutely. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay. Well,
I'll leave the poll here for you to kind of just quickly reflect.
No, absolutely. Thank you again. Thank you, Sanjay. for that wonderful piece. And welcome and hello to everyone, morning, evening, afternoon. It's very early morning here for me, roughly 6:20 in the morning, enjoying it. So it's interesting, and I think what we are seeing here in the summary is that people are saying that social enterprises do collaborate, but about 50% believe that I suspect more collaboration is necessary. But I think it is, what is, the second question is very telling, is that if we want to really outpace these problems, as Sanjay puts it, we do need to collaborate. And I think this is a very interesting setup for the rest of the conversation today. This third question is where we want to focus on, is saying, how do we go from the conceptual clarity on the need for collaboration to saying that, we need to collaborate, and here are some ways that we can do that. So hopefully you'll get something out of this session in that direction as well. So Sahana, do I need to switch my...
So you could just go under this view options that you see on top. You're viewing Sanjay Purohit's screen.
I've given you controls. Anand, you can click and move forward.
Okay.
If you click this, the slide should change.
It is not changing.
Is it in the name of, okay, approve.
I got it. Yeah.
Are you okay?
Yes.
All right. Okay, in the interest of time, just tell me next.
No, thank you, Sanjay. So what we did is many of you, thanks a lot for responding to the, the survey that was sent out with the invite. We actually felt that many of the questions that came back were actually quite interesting and insightful in of themselves. So we're just going to leave them. I suggest, it'd be less intrusive if you can just take a moment to read. These are questions that came back from many of the participants today. We will share a copy later, so don't worry if we proceed without you having read all the questions. But I thought it'll be a good idea to get a sense for what everybody's thinking before we get into this session, the rest of this session. I think we could go to the next slide, Sanjay. Maybe next screen. Oh, that's it. Yeah. So yeah, I hope you were able to get a flavor for what is on people's minds as they come into this session. Thank you again. I can't thank you enough. I think we learned a lot looking at some of those questions. They raised questions that we weren't explicitly thinking about. So hopefully, as we go through today's session and the subsequent, the following 3 sessions, we should be able to address some or all of these things. And of course, we will have a lot of time for Q&A, as this the design of this session is to ensure that we have 15 minutes of Q&A after each part of this presentation. So we invite your thoughts and comments. Yeah. So let me get started. Once again, thank you for giving me the opportunity, and thank you for taking time out. I know for some of you, compared to previous sessions, this is at a slightly odd time, just to accommodate some global timeframes, but welcome again. So the question, as Sanjay put it, is how do we work together, and how do we essentially create an enabling environment for us to work together? So before we, if you could go to the next slide, Sanjay. we looked at this problem from one specific perspective. There are many ways to look at it, but if you were to just think about it, look at the layman's perspective. Today, I mean, there are reports that there are over 20 lakh or 200,000 NGOs in India, or rather 2,000 in that. Yeah, but 2 million NGOs in India. Over 20,000, if you look at the recent FCRA list. There are over 1.5 million nonprofits in the US itself. So there is there are ample number of organizations out there trying to work with communities, working on some of the challenges that we're all interested in seeing resolved. So that is not an issue. If you can go to the next slide. And neither is funding. I mean, I think, yes, there is always, as I meet with different organizations and people across the sector, it is clear that there, in certain areas, there is a lack of resources, and there is always, the door is always open for much more funding and resources to come in. But if you really think about it, even while there is that appetite will always be there, we should wonder, saying, you know, despite having 2 million NGOs in India, 1.5 million NGOs in the US, and similar situation in many other places in the world, why aren't these problems really going away? Why aren't we seeing any significant shifts in the way that these problems manifest? Why do these problems continue to outpace our ability to solve them? So if we want to think about, increase in investment, I think we also need to look within and say, given the existing investment that is happening, given all the existing interest and amazing people that are there in the ecosystem, how can we amplify our collective impact in a nonlinear fashion? And I think there are certain good reasons for doing this. Thank you. So one of the I use this, and this is not meant to be have any sort of religious tone. If you can go to the previous slide, Sanjay. But I was saying that we look at some large programs coming in, particularly in ecosystems that haven't had massive investment. If you bring in huge number of new resources, or if you bring in large budgets and large funding resources, I keep, my joke is that, the Gopuram, which is if you take a South Indian temple, the tower, the Gopuram will grow longer, but the god will remain the same size. There are, the more resources you put into these ecosystems, sometimes the structures, the bureaucracy, the processes required to administer and deploy fund actually take precedence and take a long time to establish before any amount of those resources trickle down to the individuals that are working in the communities or the communities themselves. So we cannot reach and have impact at scale unless we can demonstrate our ability to translate these resources to nonlinear impact. And I think this is one of the most important challenges I believe we face as a community of practitioners. Next page, Sanjay. So with that in mind, we've been looking at this ecosystem. We've been talking, mostly learning from people that we've worked with across the world. And we're starting to realize that there are some real reasons why possibly we're stuck in this sort of inefficient equilibrium. Here are some 3 reasons that come up very often. Number one, we do realize, particularly when it relates to commons and areas of natural resource management, water, health, sanitation, and so on and so forth, you'll realize that everybody needs to, believes that building participatory capacity is very important on the ground, locally in the communities, either practitioners or community members, community leaders, institutional capacity, and so on and so forth. But the sad challenge is that most organizations, many of them, these initiatives are tackled through programmatic efforts. And almost all of these programs start from scratch. Very few programs come in and leverage all the resources that have been trained in the past. In fact, one of the biggest challenges we found is, despite millions of people being trained over the years, if you go and ask somebody saying, where are these people and how do we leverage them? The answer is usually that we don't know where they are, and we don't know if they're still continuing in this space. So that tells you the level of inefficiency. The second one is, we see a lot of waste and duplication of efforts. For example, we've had I'll take topics like water, sanitation, health. They're not new. They've been around for decades, and we've had organizations working in these spaces many years. They've generated a lot of very interesting artifacts. For example, maps, reports around water quality, where the water comes from, the source data, the supply side, demand side, demographic information, so on and so forth. There's tons of effort that has gone in. Some of these do change pretty often, so they're dynamic pieces of information. But much of this is actually something that you could use for years to come, because they relate to the topography, they'll relate to the the land, the sources of water, and so on and so forth, which are more static in nature, but they're nowhere to be found. If you were to go to some of these, I think we exited the screen. Yeah, to the second one, there are a lot of artifacts we find that could be used again and again to make decisions in the coming years. But unfortunately, in most cases, we find that these artifacts are recreated. And it takes a lot of effort to build the capacity and recreate these artifacts. So that's another huge opportunity that we believe. Is everybody able to hear me? I see a note from Smita saying she can't hear.
Yeah, I'm able.
Yeah,
okay.
I can hear you, Anand.
Thank you, Shima. So the third one is data, and we see this again and again. I think there is an increasing, in fact, I would argue that there's a non-linear appetite for data. The less, as impact reduces, or if there is any concerns about impact, the appetite for data actually increases substantially, because then we try to overanalyze stuff. We try to get in there and understand, does the farmer own a bicycle? How far do they go? What happens? So actually this appetite for data and collecting data is increasing and will continue to increase. But let us assume that there are good reasons for collecting that data for a second. I mean, that's a whole nother topic, saying, do we even need that kind of data? Why do we end up in that situation? And how do we use the data that we collect? But let's assume that is a valid need. But where is the data that we have collected so far, right? Where can one find that? If organization A goes into a particular state, let's say Orissa, or into a particular country like Zambia, and they want to know, saying, who else has collected data here, either demographic or otherwise? Is there a way that we can, we intend to collect that data. We are working with the government, we have a mandate or whatever it is, but we would like to see what has already been collected. If there is a way that we could do that, it is incredibly hard to do this today. And therefore, we can see that there's tremendous amount of inefficiency today. There's a lot of redundancy, there's very little reuse. And also there are certain other issues that come up, which is, even though, imagine some of this data is available, may not be widely available, but if you hire a few researchers, you might be able to find it. Question is, can you trust that data enough to take action with it, right? I keep using this example of water quality. If party A collects the quality of water data and then puts out a report saying this water needs, it has the following problems, would somebody come in 2 days from now, simply look at this data and start, putting some, making some interventions, start putting some medicine in the water? The answer is no. And I use this in a sort of a, just to illustrate the point. But the idea is that saying, what can we do to make sure that the data that we leave behind has enough information or trust built into it that somebody can come follow up and do something with that data that matters to the problems that we're solving. If we could move to the next slide, Sanjay. Again, thank you for volunteering. So we went back to this idea saying, okay, it's one thing, as we ourselves talk about from a societal platform perspective, one of the things that struck me the most as I was part of this societal platform thinking process is that it's not about identifying many problems and solving each one of them. Because if you approach problems as particularly large, complex problems that way, our belief is that if you solve one problem, the next problem will take its place. So the question was, what is the pivotal problem? How do we view this from how do we view that equilibrium that we want to achieve? If this equilibrium is unsatisfactory, what is a good equilibrium? What does that picture of success look like? So we turn to nature, and apologies for the the picture here. It was hand drawn, but think about nature as a implicitly collaborative ecosystem. Cows are grazing, trees are growing, birds are doing their thing. And, the cows don't need to know what the plans of the trees are. The trees don't need to know what the cow plans to do today, but they somehow coexist. There is one of the most amazing things that I find is that all living things consume and generate nutrients. And when they're alive, and then they become nutrients when they're dead. And in some amazing magical sort of way, these nutrients, macro or micronutrients, end up, giving life to something completely unimagined by the person who contributed the nutrients. So how does this happen? And these nutrients are essential for life to survive on land or underwater. So we took this example and we said, if inspired by this, if we could go to the next slide, would it be possible for us to generate such nutrients? Imagine all of us are the equivalents of cows and, goats and trees, and there are millions of us that co-inhabit this space. What if we could generate digital nutrients from interactions that we have across the ecosystem? And what if those digital nutrients were accessible to all other organizations, programs, or individuals or communities? And essentially the question being, can we mimic nature's theory of change to create an intrinsically collaborative ecosystem? Next slide, Sanjay. Thank you. And if we were able to do that, the idea that we can create a nutrient-rich environment for societal development is very attractive. So we started looking at it and saying, what would be an example of a nutrient, right? And we started to find that actually there's tons of it. And these are, as Sanjay would call it, context invariant elements that when it is produced, you don't necessarily, or it exists, but it doesn't exist for only one purpose. It could be used for many reasons. So for example, knowledge is one thing that is common. Most organizations, most communities that are solving problems tend to seek knowledge, and having access to that knowledge or expertise is definitely one of those things. And most of the organizations that operate and work on problems tend to generate knowledge as well. So what if we took knowledge? Expertise is another thing. Data is another thing, right? There's a lot of demographic information. There's information about land, water, air, so on and so forth. What if we were to so we started to realize that there is possibly a way that we can relate to this nature's theory of change. And there are nutrients that get generated across the ecosystem that are desired by others. Question is, how do we take these nutrients and make them available where people need them, and in order to compress operating costs, drive nonlinear outcomes, and so on and so forth. So if you can move to the next slide. So what does such a imagination give us? What does it look like? So in our work over the last couple of years, we realized that there are some simple things that come up again and again. For example, if you have program charter, right? Simple question. If you were going to operate in a new state, let's say organization A starting a new program in the state of Uttar Pradesh or Meghalaya or Zambia or Uganda, wherever, and when they walk in, wouldn't it be nice for them to be able to quickly ascertain who else is operating in this space? Have some level of situational awareness to say what other organizations are operating here and what are their charters. And if I wish to contact one of them, who do I contact? Simple question. Today, it is incredibly hard to do that unless you are extremely well connected. Similarly, you can also leave behind other artifacts like training content and videos. And we're realizing increasingly that people intended to do it. They don't produce, particularly in the social sector, they don't produce this content and training material with the intent of keeping it with themselves. There are a few organizations that feel that way, but I would say vast majority of them have always done this with the intent of sharing it much more widely. Trained practitioners, for example, almost all organizations end up training people and investing a lot in building their capacity to deal with some very complex problems, facilitation, community mobilization, etc., etc. But nobody knows who these people are, or very few people have access to them. So people come, after the fact, and they continue to train new people without leveraging the existing people. Field assessment reports. So this is one area which we talked about. What about common sense policies? Imagine if a state decided to come up with a policy that said that anybody who operates in the social sector or is involved in social development initiatives in this state should leave behind data and artifacts, right? That these are artifacts that belong to the community, so you should leave them behind. What if we could just simply, and I think we're almost there, it is assumed that this is the norm, but it is not explicitly stated. So this could be one way to do it. And finally, where do we leave all of these artifacts? You know, what if we had some sort of a shared digital infrastructure to house these artifacts so that the information, the data, the documents, or whatever it is relating to a community are left behind in such a way that the community or anybody interacting with that particular community can access those documents or artifacts and data and start to use them. So essentially what we call tools with rules, right? It's not that this is so open that you start raising concerns about, you know, exploitation, misuse, etc. We have to come up with, you know, mechanisms for us to protect the primary interest of the communities that we serve. But this is just something that we've been working on and imagining. So I'm going to stop here, if we can. Yeah. And maybe we can take some questions. Again, this is not meant to be a teaser of sorts, but I think the next session is going to go into a little more detail. But we wanted to stop here and elicit some thoughts, some questions from everybody before we proceed. How are we doing on time, Sahana?
Yeah, we're good. Don't worry. We have 10 minutes for questions.
All right. So any questions, any thoughts, any comments? I see some.
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
Hello?
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, so I like the idea of, you know, this construction of artifacts and, you know, the community getting to use it and things like that. But again, so I come from a thinking of what we call ethnotechnology and how we construct these artifacts. And that's why I'm very scared of the anthropologist, ethnographer who goes there, because when the community constructs the artifact, they construct it from a technology and from the ground, from how they can build it and interact with it, and it benefits the society. But when someone is parachuted and constructs that artifact, it really doesn't hold the community instead, rather it inframes the community as a commodity. How do we bridge this gap where that artifact actually is by the community, a voicing of the community, and therefore then disseminated will, and as well as the rights remain with the community as part of the commons?
Perfect. No, it's a great question. I think, see, like we said, there are, I think if you, at least the sectors that we're working in, we do see a tremendous amount of focus already on participatory models. So, which addresses part of the question that you had, which is, you know, who decides what interventions happen at the community level? Who decides what benefits the community desires? Who decides the balance between ecological and economic outcomes? And I think increasingly what we're finding is that the consensus is that it has to be participatory for many reasons. One is it's the right thing to do. And two, that it's the only way for you to be able to reach and have an impact at scale. You know, parachuting people from the outside has severe limitations. So I think that is one part of it. But you're right. I think we also need to consider that when we're building infrastructure to say, what are the implications of these? Are those things we should intervene in, or are those things that will get sorted out as people use it and interact with each other? But I'll leave it at that. I am not sure I have a full answer for it, but thank you for the question.
Ameya, you have raised your hand. Would you like to unmute and share your question, please?
Yeah, thanks, Sahana. Anand, I think related in some ways to the previous question is, you know, when I design an artifact, I have a particular audience or user in mind. What you're describing is a scenario where I don't know who the user might be or what they might want to do with it, right? And I'm sort of struggling to wrap my mind around that. How do I create and leave something that will be useful for persons unknown, for purposes unknown?
It's a great question. I think of it this way, Ameya. What we found so far is, what if you just generate and leave behind whatever you need in order to perform the work you are performing in that community. Don't try to design it for the person coming after you, but rather leave behind what you have already performed. So let's say you create a resource map that identifies the different areas of that village and where water is, what is the recharge area, what is the discharge area, where the lake is and what the lake size was, whatever it is, whatever survey that you did, just leave it behind and trust that the communities, if the community participated in that process, then the community might put that to use in the future. Okay, today, even that simple thing is not possible. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question on chat and I request Sanjay to come in here. This also implies some degree of comfort with digital spaces. What about communities who do not have this comfort? Sanjay, you're on mute, Sanjay.
It's a great question because in the end, when you're looking at these kind of artifacts, knowledge, there are multiple levels of it. One is that people who work with these communities, how they access, for example, when you work in education, there's an initiative called Convergence. So you look at digital, radio, community interactions at the local level, movies, television. I think we should distinguish between the 3 C's: the content, the container, and the channel. And obviously, people who are designing content are not designing in the sophisticated way, but the people who are designing the infrastructure to manage that knowledge or those assets or those tools have to think about diverse applications and design it such that we can separate the content from its containers so that we can recontainerize, because everybody may not have smartphones or internet access, or they might only have the possibility of consuming over an IVR, or not even that, could only be that they can consume it over a local radio. And I think that's a more refined attempt at whoever is trying to build such a glue or such an infrastructure for the sector, like you'll hear it from Arghyam, because how do you design for diversity is an important element of this entire process. On the previous question also, I wanted to just reflect one thing. There are 4 kinds of people who create assets, or what Anand was talking about, nutrients. There are people who are connected contributors, which means that they are happy to give you what they have created. Go ahead, you can take it. But there are more sophisticated contributors who are called generous members, who will actually go the extra mile to create it for consumption by people who are not connected. Everybody is not a generous member. Most of the people are happy to be connected contributors. You say, here it is, you take it. And that is why people who create the shared enabling infrastructure, for example, entities like Arghyam or its ecosystem members, they would apply their thinking of how to utilize this content for a wider use rather than people who are creating only. I think this is a much deeper topic, and that's why we said this is a topic which would require multiple conversations and webinars to go into depths and details in layers. So today was supposed to be opening up the topic, listening to the questions, etc. So with that, let me go back. There are a series of questions coming in. Sahana.
Yeah. So we do have a question on funders, and we'll keep that for the 4th session in March so that you continue being with us through this journey where we'll try and get a funder for us, its perspective. I did see Bharat raise his hand. Would you like to voice your question before I go to the chat questions? Bharat?
Yes, a quick question. On the opposite end, if assets were created for all, and their intellectual property was held in the not-for-profit environment, such assets could raise substantial capital from the for-profit environment that could channel back and support marginalized populations. So probably not-for-profits could create world-class assets that are used even in the for-profit environment and create social safety nets for the marginalized. Why should we restrict ourselves to only serving the marginalized?
It's a good, no, I think it's a good thought. I think there is a part of it that we've been thinking about, but I wouldn't suggest we have any sort of an answer, is, as in the societal platform thing also, we keep saying, at the end of the day, Samaj, Sarkar, Bazaar, all of them have to work together. But interesting thought, be good to explore down the road.
So Bharat, to your thing, I would just like to add one point, when you put that against the demographic and the scale that you're trying to service, this becomes an extremely intense question, because the people you want to serve may not be the ones who can pay for the asset, but somebody else may pay. So it becomes a much more evolved model. And then if you have to apply it to, say, millions of people, the economics and the construct of that is very different. Applying something for 10,000, 15,000, 100,000, 200,000 is very different. And so I'm with you. But for example, at scale economics, the cost of recovering any fee may be more complicated than non-recovering it. Because it completely looks very, very, the math looks very different when you're talking about a population to be serviced. And so I would say, yes, it's an interesting construct, but we should simulate it, say, what does it mean at scale? And is it more beneficial to find alternative means of monetization rather than the classical way of monetizing an asset, because it may not be useful to monetize an asset.
We will take...
I just want to add one point. See, one thing we did realize as we were thinking about, somebody has to be the infrastructure builder or the person offering the infrastructure. And it's very important to ensure that that organization or individual does not accrue the benefits, that the benefits accrue to the participants, right? So this, otherwise we end up in inadvertent situations where if much of the value accrues to the provider, then that becomes a different, that creates different pathways that are unintentional, which kind of we see playing out in the current, tech scenario particularly, and some of the questions are coming there. Yeah. Actually, we can take some of these questions, Sahana.
So we'll allow for more time post Mala's session, so that Mala can bring in her expertise from the field as well. We have a minute, so Jack, if you could quickly share your question and we could respond to it in like 2 minutes, then we could move to Mala's part. Thank you, Jack.
So I find that putting a lot of information, hoping people use it and might not use it, is like building a library and only some books are borrowed and read, right? Whereas if you were to create the resource to map the motivation and aspiration of all the stakeholders, you immediately know that you can serve those who are active and motivated. And then from there, you can already start the relationship and the synergy in between. Maybe that is a better way to start than to keep on loading information that people might or might not use. And the information eventually get outdated. The second point is that whatever information you want to give for free, it will also be accessed by commercial company or exploitative politician. And so it's just like any tool can be good or bad. So you have to also understand that part when you do open source.
Thank you, Jack. Thanks, Jack. Okay, great. Thanks for those, and thanks for that, Jack. And also thanks for people who are, asking questions and also responding to it, because I think one of the intent of this is to leverage the collective wisdom of everybody who is here and not just the speakers. So on that note, I'll now hand over the presentation to Mala, who's the CEO of Arghyam, to give her perspectives from the field, and then we will leave a good 15 minutes post that for discussions with all the three speakers. Over to you, Mala.
Thank you, Sahana. Thank you, Sanjay and Anand, for setting this up so well. Pardon me, I really don't have great connectivity. I'm in a different city, so I'm going to not switch my video on. Hope you can all hear me. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Great. Awesome. So really, with all the context that we now have, I think it will possibly be easy for me to sort of switch into some of the specific stuff that Arghyam has been working on. We are really working on water security, which is at the center of public health, at the intersection of public health, climate change, and livelihoods, and really a big focus area for the country today in the midst of this pandemic. So, and what we are dealing with today is how do we amplify the great work that is happening in this ecosystem, because so many more people need this enabling faster and quicker, because that's the need of the hour. And so we talk about some of the shifts that we are trying to enable at scale using the principles that Sanjay spoke about and some of the infrastructural approaches that Anand spoke about. So as Arghyam, this is really coming out with great context and depth of understanding from doing work on the ground, 15 years of working with partners, NGO partners across the country in different hydrogeological terrains, looking at ways in which communities can manage their commons of water better, whether it's springs in the mountains or groundwater in the plains, or just issues of water quality because of depleting groundwater, chemical contamination issues, and also dabbled a little bit in urban and rural sanitation, but the real large focus has been rural water management. And through that, and through the understanding that has come from the partners, we've managed to reach about 50 lakh people in these 12, 13 years that we've been operational, and realized very quickly that the models and approaches are producing very good results. Almost 30% of all the places that we have seen these approaches work had become water secure, directionally certainly, and their dependence on tankers, etc., reduced. But when we looked at the need on the ground, we were talking in the hundreds of millions. And that's when we realized that if we are not going to chew on a large part of the vulnerable that is left unaddressed in water, then perhaps we will never be able to catch up with the problem and that is there before us. So we set ourselves this whole mission of strengthening the ability of the ecosystem to enable water security for 100 million people by 2023 as a grand challenge before us, because this is not something we were chasing, but really it's the problem that was chasing us. And then we sort of put our heads down to see what levers do we have, how do we solve for some of these frictions and amplify the capability of the ecosystem so they can actually do more with less. And that's really the need of the hour. And that's when we started speaking to the societal platform team, and the thinking from there, the design thinking, systems thinking, and the societal platform thinking that came together. And we are here today to look at what are some gaps that are there in the ecosystem, and how do we address those gaps with this thinking and see what happens when we deploy that on the ground. So this is what we observed in terms of some of the meta level gaps that we saw through the work over the 13 years with our partners. At the participant, and then this is at 3 levels: the participant level, the program level, and the ecosystem level. So really at the participant level, most of the programs were providing 2 to 3 days training across, for the entire year. And so this is what we called a high dose, low frequency training, because that's how these programs were resourced. And they would get the experts. There was a lot of friction to just find the expert and get them to the right place. And they would deliver the training and go away. And expectation from the participant was that they would actually use that training to translate it into water security. So that was what we observed. And there was a lot of focus on how do we manage the overheads of the training itself, how do we get the attendance tracked, and how do we sort of transact the content, and that largely was in the form of paper booklets. So we felt that these were 3 areas that stood out as issues that we had to fill in if we wanted to scale. And so when we looked at programs, we felt that training was happening, and a lot of the wisdom that came from the partners indicated that training was happening, but really capacity building wasn't happening, because in 2 to 3 days time, it is very difficult to build capacity. So capacity is a runtime effort. And therefore what happens is that we leave a program and then the next program comes and it starts from scratch, because there is no idea of how much capacity is built, where is that capacity, and is it really possible to access that. So that was a programmatic challenge. So a lot of programs we kind of felt that for a 4-year program, 2 years into it, and we're still sort of trying to figure out how do we bring the experts to where the capacity is required to be trained, and how do you find the participants, and how do you sort of stitch them together. So really at the end of it, we felt that this is a very time-consuming effort, and at scale it was breaking down. And therefore, adding up at the ecosystem level, there was very little situation awareness. A lot of assets, physical assets, but really no visible soft assets. So the knowledge itself was lost to the program, and the program ended. Practitioners were lost, artifacts were lost. So as a community, I mean, as Arghyam, we directly would have trained about 2,000 to 3,000 people. As an ecosystem, we would have trained maybe hundreds of thousands of people. But every time a new program starts, the same question is asked: who are the NGOs? Where are they? I mean, how do we trust them? Who are the people who are already trained? Is this the first time that we are doing a water program? So we figured that this issue has to be resolved. Otherwise, we kind of start at the same place and literally almost leave at the same place. So we're not really building momentum. And so our current interest is to see how do you convert the gaps that we saw in the previous slide. How do you close some of those gaps? So at the participant level, how do you actually turn high dose, low frequency into a low dose, high frequency training, which means that we have to enable many more interactions, not lesser interactions. How do you convert, a lot of overheads that's going on and just managing a program and tracking attendance to actually making it more digital friendly, mobile friendly, and content can also be shared so that participants are much more enabled, and they also have a track of their own attendance, and they can use it for recognition and skills. And at the program level, how do you increase observability by creating trusted, verifiable data that comes as an exhaust from the work that is happening, so that one can actually get more purposeful data in real time, so that programs can run much more efficiently. And at the same time, we can also leverage people who are trained so that the programs can get a head start. And of course, all of this adds up to the idea of digital nutrients that Anand spoke about, so that at the ecosystem level, there is liquidity, which means that there is the frictionless movement of data and resources from where it is residing to where it is required, so that there's greater transparency and there's situational awareness. So this is what we are trying to look at in the kind of context of participatory water management and in capacity building. So the idea really is, as the capacity building sessions happen, imagine if we can digitally wire them up so that these interactions are generating the data and the artifacts as nutrients. And what happens when these nutrients are available for social entrepreneurs and others to actually discover, so that they can then use them in a context, they can leverage the content, they can leverage the practitioners, and they can discover for themselves and explore for themselves, so that the dependency on external ecosystems is much, much less, and of course increases efficiency and reusability of assets. And at the same time, what if this data is also open and can be discovered by funders, researchers, community members, governments? And this is something that we found every time we start a program. Government and others tell us that, there's so many people working here, can you all sort of get together and do this, because the community is really one, and they don't particularly care if it is serviced by Arghyam or ABCD. So can you just sort of find a way to get this all together, because then you can sort of remove a lot of overlaps. And so this is really the idea. Imagine if we can do that, and if that is possible, then all of these rich data, artifacts, and people that are actually being invested in can become available in their context for newer people who come, and they can leverage this. And a lot of this, as Anand said, is not really something that you would change very often. So they have a very high shelf life. So how do you actually use that and make it much more purposed for programs to become more efficient? So that's really what we tried over the last 11 months, working with our partner ecosystem. And to start with, we said we need more interactions, not less. And so COVID, the unfortunate situation of COVID really helped catalyze this as well. And so a lot of the trainings became virtual, and the idea of actually converting some of these sessions into what we are calling guided mentoring sessions, which is really many-to-many learning at the same time in a carefully crafted and curated sort of protocol, has helped a lot of our programs really get many more unintended but desirable benefits, like women being able to participate with much less friction, and the increase in interactions at the order of magnitude of 20x, because earlier they would have to plan for physical interactions to happen, and there were a lot of cost as well as time implications to that. But just by sort of converting that to having regular weekly guided mentoring sessions, these capacity building frameworks have changed and allowed for many more people to participate, many more women to participate, and programs to take off in a way that they couldn't have done earlier. And as this happened, what we said is, let's just introduce a small change in process. We just required that all participants, whether it's trainers or trainees, scanned in and scanned out using a QR code. That's the only change that was introduced. And through this, digitally verifiable attestations were provided to the participants, who could then sort of use this to say that they were actually part of a training session. This then became an attendance record for the programs, and in addition, the participants were also able to get content which they could then download and view as they were doing the action that was required of them after the training and capacity building. So it was a win-win for both the programs as well as the participants. And as a result of this virtual interactions, enabling people to interact more and not less, interact with experts of different kinds, with government, with domain experts, and as well as this digital footprinting. What we have now across our portfolio in just 11 months in 6 states, in 9 programs, we actually have digital nutrients that are fairly substantial, 300 topics, and you can see all of that here in terms of sessions and videos and trainers and frontline workers who are actually now visible, discoverable for both the program, but also more importantly, the people themselves can actually declare that they have attended trainings and they are capable of doing and bidding for jobs. So this is something that has just happened in the past 11 months. It's green shoot still. It's not like the job is over. It's actually just begun. And what we are seeing is this data was not available to programs earlier. Runtime verifiable data was not available. And when it becomes available, we are really seeing that in some places it does create magic. Just the excitement of looking at something live that they can trust is really empowering people to do more, to repurpose some of their goals to actually become so much more efficient. It's nudging those kinds of behaviors that we expected, and we're very, very happy to see. But that's not to say that all this happens very simply. I mean, it's really quite a challenge at scale. There are many pieces that need attention. I did see some of the chat questions to say that, just because something is available, who would actually be able to use it? There's a context in which it needs to be sort of used. What about consent? What about, purpose, etc.? So I think there are all of those pieces. As we touched upon one, we kind of opened up other boxes. So as you can see, the scan in, scan out opened up. What are the policies and incentives? Why should somebody scan in and scan out? So is there a policy and hygiene that we can establish? As we did that, we realized that just because people are in a registry, it does not create liquidity. So we have to invest in creating that liquidity. So there's a line of work that's happening around that. There's a line of work happening around guided mentoring is happening, but how do you curate those sessions so that people who are not part of those sessions can also access that and get a leg up? So what are those templates and processes and just the methods of curating that's not an overhead for the system. So that's another line of work that we are working on. As we're doing that, we're looking at what is the unit of change. I mean, if it still remains a habitation or village, is that something that we are going to achieve scale with? How do you aggregate at higher levels, at block levels, at district levels, which has never happened really? Saturation hasn't happened at those large levels. So how do you work at that? What is the operating model for that? And so on and so forth, right? And I mean, data empowerment, it doesn't just happen just because data is available. You have to invest in creating that, ecosystem in which that can happen. So I think what we're really saying is that as the foundational infrastructure allows for us to make these digital nutrients, or in fact, collect these digital nutrients, we have had to deal with a lot of these issues. It's an ongoing process to actually see how can we make them more useful, more available, with the right kind of consent to the right people. And so this is what we are sort of engaged with, bringing in the right kind of partners. Not everybody will have all the expertise, but how do you bring them in? How do you allow for them to collaborate with each other so that the whole can become more than the sum of parts? And that's what we're seeing across across our 9 programs. As I said, it's a struggle, but we tell ourselves that really we have no option. Earlier we were struggling to do these very same things at subscale, but now we are struggling to do them at scale. At least there's a potential for this to become nonlinear if this works. And that's really where we are headed, to see how do you bring this together so that when it happens, we can actually see nonlinear results. And like I said, we're starting to see green shoots. It's early days, but the confidence that some of the governments are having in this, and their ability to go from X to literally almost 50X, because they have the ability to now use this infrastructure and this ecosystem, that is the confidence that we are getting to say that, okay, this is working, this is useful, and this is what people want. And as I said, it's not just Arghyam. We now have a network of 38 people who are working on this with us, driving this. We are, of course, facilitators, enablers, funders to some extent, but there's really a lot of people in the ecosystem across donors, researchers, government, practitioners who have taken this upon themselves, that this is perhaps one way that we can achieve amplification, and there is really no choice because that's the need on the ground. So really, I'm going to leave it at that. It's been tremendously exciting over the last 11 months. There were many, many moments of skepticism preceding that and during that. But I think at the end of the day, it's very fulfilling to see that there is adoption, there is excitement in this ecosystem, and a lot more demand coming our way. And that is what really keeps us going. So thank you very much for listening. And thank you, Anand, and thank you, Sanjay. We've borrowed a lot from you. We continue to borrow. And I hope that we are able to move towards our mission as we plan. Thank you. Over to you, Sahana.
Thanks, Mala. I think that was the best part was kept for the end. So on that note, we are open for questions now for the next 15 minutes. While we wait on questions, I'll just quickly go back and see for some questions on that we had from the previous part.
I can take the one from funders. I think somebody had.
Sure, go ahead. And
Sumali, Moitra, yeah, I think you said, would funders agree? Yes, I think they do. I think the question is, does it mean that you have to explicitly spend more resources to do this? The answer is actually not. I think if you do it right, you'll end up expending less energy if you do it in a systematic sort of fashion, and the nutrients become an exhaust, meaning a positive exhaust from that process. So we have seen more and more interest, and I think funders in general have been very open to the idea. Arghyam used to be a funder, is still a funder. So that's one right there. But definitely something that would be interested in exploring. But I think they still focus on impact with this as an exhaust, I think has been a, we have multiple funders supporting initiatives this way. What else? What other questions do we have?
Can I jump in and ask a question?
Sure.
Yes, of course.
Yes, I mean, it's more at a practical level. But first of all, let me thank Anand, Sanjay, and Mala for such a wonderful presentation, and it was so professionally done. Not even for a second, I was kind of bored. So thank you very much. But more on a practical level, I would like to ask that, you all talk about data and data collection and, how it can be reused. First of all, I see a lot of, opportunities out there, even for entrepreneurs to gather the data, use the data, do something out with the data. But do you all know any sources where such data is already, there, which can be explored?
Yes. And there Go ahead.
No, my question was like, I will be a bit surprised if there is no resources at all, but the ones that are there, are they not usable, or how do they work?
So I think data is a very difficult, data tends to conjure up different images. So let's talk about knowledge content, for example. And our experience has been, and particularly some ecosystems are better. Like if you go to the educational ecosystem, there's huge catalogs of knowledge available. And it's a much more stronger ecosystem in that sense, I would argue. Although I'm sure if somebody's working in the education ecosystem, they're going to say, well, there's so much more to do. But if you were to look at, say, nutrition or, infant mortality, or if you take water or some of these ecosystems, the answer is everybody says there is content and knowledge, but it's very hard to find. And it hasn't been curated, and even if it's there, there is no information around who produced this information, because some of these materials and content are of consequence. Unlike learning to do trigonometry, where you can do it at your own peril, worst case, you will get 1 mark less in your test. But, water quality, doing things around commons, you don't just go around digging the earth, and you're doing it in common areas. These are of consequence. So you need content which has some metadata, meaning you need to know who generated this data. Is this something that is approved by the government? Is this something that came from a trusted source or a well-known source? So that is the other complexity of some of this information for people to be able to use it. Does that make sense? And then, of course, practitioner information is pretty much non-existent. The unfortunate reality is 2/3 of the world's population works in this space. They do amazing things. They can do things that you and I haven't imagined, but there is no record of it.
So I actually come from the educational space. So I'm a researcher myself. But even in that area, I would say that data from social entrepreneurs or, social entrepreneurial, whatever, funding or at the macro level, meso level, data is scarce. So we are always hunting for data and we can't find enough of that. So that's the reason I asked you that where can these sources, if they exist, where can I find them? For example, in one of your slides, you showed some data about there are at least 200,000 NGOs in India. And my question would be, where did you find that information from?
Basically, so, you can say 300,000 and nobody can tell who is wrong.
Exactly. No, that's but thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. And just to correct, just to make sure, see, our primary focus was, do communities have access to this data? Because it's not about us as in a global, central view of data. It's not Google of the world, right? But do communities have data? Somebody went and did a survey in a community 2 years ago, right? And that includes common lands, private lands, and what you can do where. But that amazing piece of information may not be available to a farmer who's trying to decide where to put a farm pond, right? So our first focus was focused on that rather than a global view of how to exploit this data.
No, the presentation was great. It just opened me up into an entire different space of thinking about data and data usability. It was really helpful.
Ishan, you did have a question before and you have a comment now. Would you like to share your thoughts with us or ask a question?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. It's more of a comment.
Sure.
and I don't know whether it is required also, but yeah. The first part of the comment was about the inaccessibility of community knowledge is also a kind of a safeguard for community, because it means that somebody wants then access to that. We don't know the purpose of the person, and I think somebody already pointed out a part of it. I just wanted to emphasize upon that. The risk that it involves if it is misused, and meaning we have seen it in various ways. The traditional knowledge, especially, moving away and new things coming in, which have proved detrimental to the systems, village systems. The second point that I wanted to make is that suppose the trainings are all digital, and it reduces the meaning the inefficiency drastically. The technical part of it, I agree, it requires, and we put a lot of efforts and resources in that. But the facilitation part of it is also as important as the technical part. I would also think that the donor community maybe need to focus then on that part, because that is totally in the human domain.
Totally.
And also another point is that, meaning I am a development professional. I took a degree, and all of us were trained in PRAs and all that stuff. Yeah. And we did not understand it during our degree. We understood it in the field after 4 or 5 years. So what happens to the new people who come to the field and learn, but they have a tablet to work with?
Yeah. So Ishan, just to kind of, I think we could bring Mala in to just share her experience on some of these things of how they do it with Arghyam for Water platform.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say that we're not saying that we're substituting what's happening today. We are actually saying you need more interactions, not less. And what we're saying is, can we take away some of the interactions that happen today physically into the realm of virtual, because they can happen virtually and they're as effective, if not more, so that you release precious time for physical interactions to happen. And the focus can be on what needs to happen face to face, right? So some of those things, like you talked about, behavior change, communities getting together and doing the trade-offs, all of that cannot happen virtually. So at no point in time are we saying that we are substituting. We're supplementing in a way that it's crafted and curated to support what needs to happen on the ground. And that's the way we're looking at it in the water security. And I think that stands for any participatory management. We cannot remove that element of what needs to happen and how they protect what is best for them. So
I would like, sorry, Mala. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, please go ahead, Sanjay.
I was just going to expand on what you said. See, one of the interesting challenges that we all have is that we have the fourth order of challenges with the first order of infrastructure missing. It reminds me of a story. When the idea of the global positioning system, GPS, was being discussed in the Air Force, there's a very interesting anecdote from there, that while this presentation was being made, one of the officers asked, "What does a GPS do?" And the person who was presenting said that the GPS tells you where you are. And so the officer who asked this question said, "How stupid is that? I know where I am." And I think these fundamental things that at scale, reliably, can I tell a person or an object, where is it with respect to global positioning coordinates, can be so transformative to the way we lead our lives. And I think in this endeavor, between Mala, Anand, myself, and many others who are all of us thinking through, that is the endeavor. What is that core infrastructure which will be so fundamental, so basic, that will change the meaning of enabling and capacity building, rather than the second, third, and fourth order questions of, for example, people who were thinking about GPS did not sit down and think about, do people have mobile phone? Do we need GPS? But the reality at that time was that the mobile penetration was way worse off than what it is today. Smartphones did not even exist in that sense. So I think we have to think about the future. We have to think about 5 years, 10 years, 15 years hence, and build the fundamental interconnectivity infrastructure so that we can preserve these nutrients that we are sowing into the system. The millions of dollars we are spending in training people, creating artifacts, and find some way of preserving this and amplifying the utilization through some very, very fundamental things. And all of you are so well steeped in the structure, and that's what gives us the energy to have this conversation. That can we all come together and be on that quest for what is that basic infrastructure which would change the way we do capacity building for any sector. Something which will have that unlocking effect of GPS. For example, what Mala is trying to do with the PDA and what she shared in the last 11 months, that is the quest. That it will forever change what is the meaning of asset, how it is shared, how we build this capacity, how do we amplify it. Would it be straightforward? Will it answer all the third and fourth order questions today? Probably not. But that is a journey. I just wanted to share that feeling that I got from this conversation of today.
So could I say something?
Sure, Garima.
Yes, Garima.
So just what just Sanjay said, and I've heard what I've gathered, after the presentation, which was wonderful. The presentation is that so initially I was thinking maybe the how of it we'll get to know, but as the presentation continued and now we are at the end of it, I know that we are kind of on a journey to find that how. And so there are no questions as such to anybody, but just this whole conversation brought a lot of questions to me, because it does seem like certainly it's very desirable. I mean, the poll said it, 99% people, no doubt in my mind. I think everybody wants something like that. But like, for example, when we spoke of data and we spoke of, having data that can be trusted. I believe that if you have to collect and build data that can be trusted, we will have to create a process that is uniform while we collect for collection, but will at the same time have to be capable of putting it in a diverse way, for people to use in different ways. So those challenges right now seem like very big, but of course that's what we are perhaps trying to do here. The other thing, the other thought that came to me is that when in the development sector, my experience also, and when NGOs work, and normally there is a partnership happening. I mean, there is a decent amount of partnership happening with communities as well as with the local agencies and NGOs to bring out, an effect and impact even at a local level. So I know we are looking at a bigger scale here, so I don't know exactly what is that scale right now. But even at that small scale, it's sometimes very difficult to accommodate everybody's, thinking, put them on the same page, and give them a sense of common purpose. And that again, I think, is very challenging at that scale. So that again, I feel is kind of multiple times more challenging if you want to do it at a larger scale. So just some thoughts on the topic. Thank you.
Great. So we're sharp at 9. Thanks, Garima. I think that was a great way for us to kind of come to a closure. Anand and Sanjay, do you have comments? I know Anand is willing to stay on for 10 to 15 minutes if people have questions for him. But, we would like to close it at 9 as per what the timing that we've shared. Sanjay, Mala, Anand, do you have any closing comments before we kind of wind up?
No, I think No, I think I would just say that it is certainly a complex problem and it's not easy, but we feel like the foundational piece needs to be nailed and all the layers can then be built on top. But without this, we possibly won't be able to build those layers on top sensibly. I think that's the point we're making. So what we're doing is really the underlying piece. And then people can come together, rules can be made, and adoption can increase.
Thanks, Mala.
If I can just add, what I find wonderful about this session and these interactions is there are no wrong questions. All of the questions that came up are bang on. I think they have to be addressed. And that's the challenge as well. There's the societal platform thinking, which provides your broad construct, and it gives you a direction or a thought process that could get you to a point where you can enable impact at scale. And then on the other side, there is all the learnings and the theory of change and the realities of working on the ground, the kind of stuff that Arghyam and their partners bring together. And we have to find effective ways to marry these. And then there are other stakeholders that are not represented today. But this is both the exciting part and what we found, though, is when you operate at an infrastructural level and you work with some basic human principles, actually those convergence happens much easier than we imagine. We also started this journey being a little more skeptical about possibilities and resistance and all of it. I'll be honest with you, you'd be disappointed how little resistance we faced in terms of being able to appreciate and want to participate. Of course, logistically, it is not as simple because changing individuals, changing habits, changing process, etc. takes time. Yeah. But yeah, there are lots of people on this journey, and I really look forward to more discussions on this. Thank you for your time. Sanjay, anything else?
No, I just wanted to thank everyone for the start. I think we designed this to be a 4-part series for a reason, because the beginning we are going to flare and in classical design thinking style, come back and focus. And hopefully over the 4 iterations, we will have something that comes out of this series to be a solid response to this question. I love the questions today. Thank you so much. Very excited about this journey ahead. So thanks a lot and well begun.
Thanks, Anand. Thanks, Sanjay. Thanks, Mala. Especially, we understand that you're in a different place. So special thanks for being on this. Thanks to all our participants for being part of our session. We have 3 more to come, and we will continue to stay engaged and share the recordings and feedback forms with you. Have a great day for those of you. It's morning, and good night to the rest of us who are in the other part of the world. So, yeah. Thanks, so everyone.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Sahana, for everything. Appreciate it.